My phone buzzed at 7:12 a.m., the kind of hour where bad news feels more believable because your brain hasn't fully woken up yet. The caller identification said, "Dad?" I stared at it for a second longer than normal, because my father doesn't call early unless he wants something or he's about to announce something like it's a final verdict. I answered with a simple, "Hello." His voice came through cold and flat, like he was reading a line he'd practiced for hours. "Grandpa died last night. The funeral is Friday. He left us everything. You get nothing." My mother's laughter echoed in the background, sharp and mocking. "Finally, you're out," she said, her voice clear enough that she knew I would hear it. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I would love to know who is part of our community. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, and I didn't even blink at the sound of my mother's voice. In their version of family, I had been the silent investor, footing the bill for their emotional bankruptcy for 25 years. But looking at the kitchen table, I realized the subscription had just expired. My grandfather, William, was sitting right next to me. He was 75 years old and very much alive. He held his coffee mug with steady, thin-skinned hands, watching the phone as if it were a faulty piece of machinery. I simply pressed one button, set the call to speaker, and slid the device across the table until it sat between us like a confession booth. My father kept talking. My silence always makes him assume he's winning. But today, silence was just my way of keeping the ledger clean. "You thought you were smart, playing independent," Gregory said, his voice gaining a greasy confidence. "Now it doesn't matter. The coastal estate, the accounts, the $15 million legacy, it's all ours. We've already handled the attorney." I watched Grandpa's face. There was no panic, just a small tightening of his jaw, like a judge marking a lie in a transcript. My mother, Patricia, leaned in, her voice sounding like honey poured over broken glass. "Come to the funeral, Emily. Or don't. Either way, you're no longer part of this family." I looked at the sealed envelope sitting in front of Grandpa. That envelope wasn't prepared overnight. It was the result of months of quiet documentation, irregular bank activity, medication discrepancies, and access logs from the estate. Grandpa had hoped he'd never need it, but he kept it ready. It had a thick attorney letterhead and a red wax seal that looked like a drop of blood against the white paper. Beside it was a plain manila folder. Grandpa didn't open them, he didn't need to. He just placed 2 fingers on the folder, a man deciding that a very long door was about to close. "Are you even listening?" my father snapped. He sounded disappointed that I wasn't sobbing. "I'm listening," I said. My voice was clinical. Clinical was the only way to handle a $15 million theft attempt. "Good," Gregory exhaled. "Then you'll do the right thing and stay away from the attorney's office. We're driving to the estate tomorrow to take inventory. We'll mail you whatever junk you left there." I looked at the call timer on the screen. 7:13, 7:14. Every second was more evidence. Grandpa leaned slightly toward the phone. He didn't raise his voice, and he didn't use the tone of an angry relative. He used the tone of the man who built the empire they were trying to steal. "Hello," he said. The silence on the other end was so abrupt, it felt like someone had cut the power. The laughter stopped. The breathing stopped. For 2 seconds, there was nothing but the electrical buzz of the kitchen light and the faint crackle of a connection that couldn't handle the truth. "Dad?" My father's voice finally came back, thin and trembling. Grandpa looked at me, then at the envelope, then back at the phone. He wasn't giving them the mercy of an explanation. He was just starting the audit. I don't remember how long the silence lasted. All I know is that in the seconds after Grandpa Williams said hello, I wasn't the same person who had answered the phone. I was done with the performance. For years, I had been the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for their emotional bankruptcy while I thinned my own spirit to keep Grandpa alive. My father, Gregory, and my mother, Patricia, didn't see the work. They didn't see the 3 a.m. hospital runs or the meticulous management of the $15 million coastal estate. To them, I was just a line item that should have been deleted from the ledger long ago. I remember a rainy afternoon 3 years ago, when Patricia stood in the hallway of the estate, the air smelling of wet cedar and her expensive perfume. She watched me sort through Grandpa's medical files and called me a civilized maid with an expensive degree. She said it with a sharp, polished smile, as if she were giving me a performance review. In her mind, my value was purely functional. I was useful until I wasn't. And according to that phone call at 7:12 a.m., I had just outlived my usefulness. It is a chilling thing to hear your mother laugh at the supposed death of her own father, but that is the trap of cruelty normalization. Over the past decade, they had stopped seeing Grandpa as a human being and started seeing him as a frozen asset. They hadn't become monsters overnight. They had simply spent years convincing themselves that their greed was actually a form of justice. When you normalize the idea that people are just tools for your own comfort, you stop feeling the weight of your own malice. They weren't mourning a man. They were celebrating the clearance of a debt. To them, this wasn't a tragedy. It was the successful closing of a business deal. I had been the one protecting this legacy from Gregory's disastrous whims for years. While they were touring vineyards in Italy or skiing in the Alps, I was at the coastal estate, blocking my father's attempts to take out predatory loans against the land. I was the one who saw the signatures that didn't quite match on the investment account withdrawal forms, and quietly moved the assets under a new, ironclad trust. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, assuming the credit limit was infinite. Now, as I looked at Grandpa sitting there, vibrant and steady, I realized this wasn't going to be a breakdown. This was going to be a total audit. "Dad?" My father's voice came back thin and disbelieving. My mother, Patricia, didn't speak at all at first. I could hear her breathing in short, sharp inhales, like she was trying to decide whether to panic or perform. Grandpa William didn't give them the mercy of confusion. He stayed close to the phone and spoke in the same calm tone he used when he taught me how to do things the right way the first time. "I heard everything," he said. My father, Gregory, tried to recover control immediately. "Dad, this is a misunderstanding," he said, the words tripping over each other. "We got a call," they said. "No," Grandpa cut in, his voice as sharp as a forensic audit. "You didn't say you got a call. You said you got everything." My father went quiet again. My mother's voice slid in, soft and sweet like honey poured over broken glass. "Dad, thank God," she said, almost crying on command. "We were so scared. We thought." "You laughed," he said. One sentence, one fact, and it landed harder than any accusation. My mother's sweetness cracked. I could feel the temperature in the kitchen drop. This was the moment the watchman finally spoke. For years, I had watched Grandpa William sit in his study, a silent observer of his own family's slow descent into entitlement. He had seen the way Gregory looked at the coastal estate, not as a home, but as a series of decimal points. He had seen the way Patricia treated my care for him as a functional necessity, a role for a daughter they had already mentally evicted. Grandpa had spent decades hoping that greed would eventually give way to gratitude, that the blood in their veins would mean more than the ink on a check. He told me once, his voice heavy with the weight of years, "I already regret what I tolerated." His silence hadn't been weakness. It had been a final, exhausting hope for their redemption. But as they laughed at his ghost, that hope didn't just die, it was formally revoked. Gregory's tone shifted. The theatrical grief was gone, replaced by a desperate, ugly urgency. "Why are you with her?" he demanded. "She's been poisoning you against us. She's manipulating an old man." My stomach tightened, not with fear, but with the cold satisfaction of watching a predator realize the cage door has been locked from the outside. Gregory wasn't done. He raised his voice, volume attempting to drown out the evidence. "Are you even thinking clearly? The court is already involved, Dad. It's for your own good. We filed an emergency petition for temporary guardianship because you are mentally incapacitated." He claimed Grandpa was senile and confused, a term they used to justify taking the keys to a $15 million kingdom. He was trying to establish that Grandpa lived at the remote mountain cabin, a place where they could control access and isolate him from the one person who actually cared if he was breathing. "If you won't listen, the court will make you listen," Gregory hissed. Grandpa didn't blink. He simply looked at the red timer on my screen and then at the manila folder. He had been the one to bring the evidence to my table. He wasn't the victim of their script. He was the one closing the theater. The attorney's office was silent, the kind of silence that feels expensive and heavy. Walter sat behind a mahogany desk that looked like it cost more than my parents' car. He didn't look at me with pity. He looked at the documents with the same precision Grandpa William used to build his empire. "They moved early," Walter said, his voice flat and clinical. He turned his monitor toward us, displaying a digital paper trail that my parents thought was invisible. A log from the bank showed a death notification request submitted at 6:48 a.m. My father, Gregory, hadn't even waited for the sun to fully rise before trying to erase his own father from the banking system. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the mahogany surface. The recording of the 7:12 a.m. call was queued up. When I hit play, the room filled with Gregory's cold verdict and my mother Patricia's sharp, victorious laughter. Hearing it again in this sterile office made it sound even more like a confession than a conversation. This wasn't a family misunderstanding. It was a digital trail of a $15 million fraud. Finally, you're out, Patricia's voice echoed against the legal volumes on the shelves. Walter stopped the recording. His pen didn't shake. He just wrote one word on his legal pad. Fraud. They didn't just lie to you, Emily, Walter said, looking directly at me. They touched the bank's deceased customer protocol. That is a federal system. And systems don't care about family history or supposed intent. They care about logs and timestamps. Grandpa William sat beside me, his back as straight as a ledger line. He wasn't mourning a son. He was witnessing a breach of contract. Gregory had asked for a death certificate before a doctor had even seen a patient. It was a sloppy, desperate move by people who believed their prey was already a ghost. Walter pulled up the guardianship petition Gregory had filed. It was dated for today. There was an expedited hearing request set for 2 p.m. They were claiming Grandpa was mentally incapacitated, a state of confusion that required immediate intervention to protect the assets. They had even listed the remote mountain cabin as his primary residence to justify an emergency court order in a remote jurisdiction. They wanted a judge to hand them the keys to $15 million before Grandpa William could even finish his morning coffee. We filed the counter affidavit now, Walter said, his fingers flying across the keyboard. We include the recording, the bank fraud alerts, and the live camera feed from the estate. Grandpa William took the silver pen. He signed his name with a hand that was steadier than mine. This wasn't a family reunion. It was a foreclosure on a relationship that had been in default for 20 years. My father had tried to bring the court to Grandpa's front door. Instead, we were bringing the full weight of the law to his own plan. My mother hadn't just played the part of a grieving daughter. She had played the part of an amateur chemist. While we were finalizing the counter affidavit, I realized that my mother's betrayal wasn't just a line on a court document. It was a chemical footprint in Grandpa's bloodstream. I found the proof in her vanity drawer back at the estate, hidden behind bottles of expensive anti-aging cream. She had swapped Grandpa William's blood pressure medication for a mild sedative. It was a calculated move to ensure he appeared disoriented and confused, the exact evidence Gregory needed to file that emergency guardianship petition. This wasn't just a family disagreement over a $15 million coastal estate. This was a criminal strategy. By swapping the pills, Patricia had intentionally compromised the health of her own father to gain control of his accounts. My compassion for her had been a luxury she had overdrafted long ago, but this was a total breach of human contract. I held the vial of sedatives in my hand, and the anger I felt wasn't loud. It was clinical. It was the feeling of a balance sheet finally being reconciled. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with an alert from the security system at the coastal estate. I opened the live feed and felt my pulse jump. Brandon, my father's cousin, wasn't just taking inventory, as Gregory had claimed. He was in Grandpa's study, wearing a heavy-duty apron and holding a power grinder. The blue sparks from the metal-on-metal friction lit up the dark room as he worked to cut open the safe built into the floor. He was a common thief with a power tool, and he was doing it on camera for the world to see. I showed the screen to Grandpa and Walter. Grandpa William watched the feed with a terrifying stillness. He didn't gasp at the sight of his own home being violated. He simply noted the time. 7:54 a.m., he said. The safe contains the original physical deeds and the emergency cash reserves. Brandon was caught in the act, captured in high-definition pixels as he tried to steal the physical ending of Grandpa's life story. Walter picked up his phone and called the local sheriff's department again. We have active grand larceny and elder abuse in progress at the coastal estate, he said. The suspects are using power tools to bypass a secure safe. We have a live video feed and documentation of medication tampering. This was the kill shot. By attempting to take the assets by force and tampering with Grandpa's health, Gregory and Patricia had removed any remaining path to redemption. They weren't just ungrateful heirs anymore. They were criminals facing multiple felony counts. The transition from a civil dispute to a criminal record was complete. My father thought he could use the court to isolate Grandpa, but instead, he had provided the court with a roadmap to his own incarceration. Inside my phone, the feed glowed with the reflection of police sirens finally pulling into the driveway of the estate. The blue and red lights danced across Brandon's panicked face as he realized he was trapped. This wasn't a family drama anymore. It was an execution of judgment. The driveway of the coastal estate was crowded with vehicles that didn't belong there. I saw my father's luxury sedan parked crookedly near the entrance. a symbol of his premature victory. Inside, the house smelled of expensive cigars and the sharp, metallic scent of a safe being forced open. Gregory and Patricia were in the grand study, surrounded by open drawers and scattered files, already treating a legacy like a fire sale. Gregory was holding a bottle of Grandpa's finest scotch, pouring a drink to celebrate a death that hadn't occurred. They didn't hear us enter. They were too busy arguing over which pieces of art to sell first to cover Gregory's mountain of gambling debt. I stood in the doorway for a beat, watching the two people who had raised me behave like scavengers in a graveyard. Then, I stepped aside. Grandpa William walked past me, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor with a weight that stopped the room. Gregory dropped his glass. The sound of it shattering against the floor was the only noise for 5 long seconds. Patricia shrieked, her hand flying to her throat as she backed away from the man she thought she had successfully handled. Gregory's face went a sickly shade of gray, his eyes darting toward the phone he had used to declare a man dead only 2 hours earlier. He looked like he was seeing a ghost. But Grandpa William didn't look like a spirit. He looked like the owner of the house. "Dad," Gregory stammered, his voice thin and hollow. "It's a miracle. We thought. We were told." "You were told exactly what you wanted to hear," Grandpa William said. His voice wasn't loud, but it held the cold finality of a closing statement. He didn't look at the mess they had made of his study. He looked directly at his son. "I sat at Emily's kitchen table and listened to you laugh about my funeral. I listened to your wife call my granddaughter an outsider while you planned to steal the land I built with my own hands." Gregory fell to his knees. It was a pathetic, calculated move, a desperate attempt to summon a mercy he had never shown me. "Dad, please, we're in trouble. The debts. I'll lose everything if you don't help." "You already lost everything," Grandpa said, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out the notarized amendment we had just filed at the attorney's office. "I revoked all your inheritance rights exactly 4 minutes ago. You get nothing from the estate, you get nothing from the accounts, and you get exactly 60 seconds to leave this property before the officers standing in the hallway arrest you for trespassing, forgery, and elder abuse." I walked forward and placed a folded piece of paper on the desk. It was the formal eviction notice. Gregory looked up at me, his eyes full of the same cruelty he'd used his whole life, but now it was wrapped in a layer of absolute terror. "Emily, you can't do this. We're your parents." "No," I said, my voice clinical and quiet. "You share my DNA. Family is something you earned, and you've been in default for 20 years. I already handled it." I stepped back and watched as the sheriff's deputies moved in to escort them out. Gregory was still begging, his voice echoing down the hallway until the front door finally clicked shut. The silence that followed was the first real peace I had felt in my own home. Gregory and Patricia didn't just lose a $15 million inheritance. They lost their freedom. The criminal charges for forgery and medication tampering were ironclad, backed by the very systems my father thought he could manipulate. They are currently serving their sentences, facing the poverty and isolation they once tried to impose on me. Kenneth and Brandon didn't escape either. Their involvement in the safe-cracking and bank fraud ensuring they would spend the next decade answering to the law rather than their own greed. I officially took over the management of the coastal estate, but I didn't keep it as a monument to wealth. I transformed the main house into a support center for people navigating the same kind of family exploitation I had survived, a place for those who have been written out of their own stories to find their voices again. Grandpa William still sits on the porch every morning, watching the tide come in. We don't talk about the past much. We don't have to. The audit is complete. This letter is for those of you who have always felt like you were standing on the edge of your own family. For the ones who were treated like a resource rather than a relative, and who were made to feel that your worth was tied to your compliance. I want you to know that your value is not a line item in someone else's ledger. You are not a burden, and you do not owe your life to people who only see you as a functional necessity. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop playing your part in their script. When you set that boundary, you aren't being cruel, you are being honest. And that honesty is the only thing that will ever truly set you free. Don't let anyone define your value by the size of your bank account or the depth of their insults. If you felt empowered by this journey, please share this story to help others who feel alone find their strength. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a moment where justice finally takes the lead.